Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're diving into something totally fascinating to me, the world of Indian agriculture.
Yeah. It's way more than just growing food, though.
Oh, I bet. From what I've seen, it seems like agriculture in India is inseparable from animal husbandry. Like,
No.
they're two sides of the same coin, right?
Exactly. In India, it's not just about fields and tractors. It's this ancient system where humans, animals, and the land are all intertwined, super connected.
And that totally makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Think about it. India has to feed a massive population,
Yeah.
and they've been doing it for centuries, often with limited land.
Right. And a huge part of that is livestock.
Uh-huh.
India is home to a ridiculously large percentage of the world's livestock population.
Seriously? How huge are we talking?
Hold on to your hats because this one blew my mind. 10.7% of the global livestock population.
Get out. 10.7%. I mean, I know it's a big country, but wow. Okay, so that's a lot of animals.
Mm.
And they're not just pets, right? They play a vital role in Indian agriculture.
Absolutely. One of the sources put it perfectly. Since ancient times in India, agriculture and animal husbandry are interwoven with the intricate fabric of the society in cultural, religious, and economical ways as mixed farming.
Mixed farming. I like the sound of that. So it's this idea of crops and livestock existing in harmony, each one supporting the other.
You got it. Think of it like this beautifully balanced system that's been fine-tuned over centuries.
Okay, so paint the picture for me. What does this mixed farming system actually look like in action?
Well, imagine a farmer plowing his field, right? But instead of a tractor, he's using a team of oxen. That's mixed farming at its core.
Okay, that makes sense. The oxen provide the power, and in return, they get fed from the crops that are grown. It's a closed loop.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. The animals provide manure, which is a natural fertilizer. They can be used for transportation. It's all incredibly interconnected.
So it's like this incredible dance where every step has a purpose and everything is connected. But hold on, back up a sec. You mentioned earlier that India has a huge percentage of the world's livestock. How on earth do they manage that with limited land?
Well, here's the real kicker. India manages that incredible feat with only 2.29% of the world's land.
Whoa, wait. Did you just say they have over 10% of the world's livestock, but only about 2% of the world's land?
Yeah, that's right. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It's like fitting a whole bunch of puzzle pieces onto a tiny puzzle board. So we're not just talking about cows and chickens here. These animals are literally essential to the entire agricultural system in India.
100%. They're not just a source of food, they're a source of power, fertilizer, transportation. They're vital to the livelihoods of millions, especially for those practicing subsistence farming.
Subsistence farming, you mean families who rely on what they grow and raise themselves to survive.
Right. And for those families, livestock can be a safety net, a buffer against crop failures, a source of income. They're deeply woven into the fabric of rural life in India.
It's amazing how something born out of necessity becomes so central to a whole way of life, to a culture's identity. But I have a feeling that this level of dependence, this interconnectedness, probably comes with its own set of unique challenges. Am I right?
You are so right. And one of the biggest of those challenges is something we call fodder. You could think of it as the lifeblood of this whole system. It's what keeps everything running.
Fodder. Okay, so like animal feed.
Exactly. It's what the livestock eat. And in a system as intricately balanced as India's, well, the availability and quality of that fodder, it's a pretty big deal.
I bet. I mean, we're talking about a huge number of animals to feed.
Yeah.
How do they even begin to produce enough fodder for all those cows and goats and everything else?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And the answer, well, it's complicated. India is a big place. Lots of different climates, different farming practices. What works in one region might not work in another.
Okay, so how do you even begin to untangle something that complex? Like, how do you measure the ins and outs of fodder production across an entire subcontinent?
Well, you got to hand it to the researchers, right? They've done some really incredible work trying to get a handle on this.
Okay, so what are the researchers finding? What's the overall picture when it comes to this whole fodder situation?
Well, one of the things that really jumped out from the research was this. When it comes to green fodder, that's things like fresh grasses, legumes, that sort of thing, there was a pretty significant deficit across India.
A deficit, so they're not producing enough green fodder to meet the demand.
Exactly. But here's the thing. That shortage, it's not evenly distributed. Some regions are actually doing okay.
Really? Okay, so it's like a regional disparity thing?
Exactly. The research highlights, for example, that regions like Punjab and Haryana, they're actually doing pretty well when it comes to green fodder. They've got a surplus, in fact.
A surplus. So what are they doing differently in those areas? Like, what's their secret?
Well, it seems like it's a few things working together. For one, they've had success with these high-yielding fodder crops, varieties that are bred to produce more. And they've also got some pretty sophisticated dairy practices in those regions. So it's like a perfect storm, but in a good way.
That's awesome. But I'm guessing that not every region has been as successful, right? Like, are there places where this fodder deficit is a really serious issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And the research points to Harkand as kind of a case in point. They're facing a huge deficit of green fodder.
Okay, huge. Like what? Give me a number.
Try a 67.7% deficit.
67.7. That's insane. What makes a place like Harkan so vulnerable to this kind of shortage?
Well, it seems like a lot of factors come into play. Lower adoption of some of those more modern technologies we were talking about earlier. Then there are things like land allocation. The amount of land dedicated to growing fodder crops varies from region to region, and that plays a role. Even the climate and soil types in Tarkand play a factor. It really highlights how complex this whole issue is.
Right, like a domino effect.
Yeah.
Even if you solve one piece of the puzzle, there's a whole bunch of other factors that can still create challenges.
Yeah.
So we've got this green fodder shortage, but I'm guessing it's not the whole story, right? I mean, we talked earlier about dry fodder, too. Things like crop residues. Hey,
Yeah.
how does that fit into the picture?
That's a great point. And you're right, it gets even more nuanced when you factor in dry fodder. Because the interesting thing there is that while there's still a deficit overall, the regional differences become even more stark.
Really? How so?
Well, remember how we talked about access to forests for grazing being limited in some areas? Well, it turns out that when it comes to dry fodder, forests actually play a vital role. That's where a lot of that dry fodder comes from, in addition to those crop residues.
Interesting. So the role of forests becomes even more important when we're talking about dry fodder. Got any examples of those regional differences, where those forest resources really make a difference?
Absolutely. Imagine the northeast zone of India, right? Lush forests, beautiful place. Well, they've actually got a 14% surplus of dry fodder, and a lot of that is thanks to those abundant forest resources.
Okay, so the Northeast is doing well on the dry fodder front. That makes sense. But what about a region that's really struggling, even with dry fodder?
In contrast to the northeast, think about the east zone. They're dealing with a 43.9% deficit of dry fodder. It's a complete flip.
Wow, talk about a tale of two zones, huh? Okay, so we're seeing these wild swings in fodder production, different regions with surpluses, others with deficits. And it sounds like a lot of it comes down to these geographic factors, climate, land use, the types of fodder being produced. Am I on the right track here?
Absolutely. But here's another layer of complexity for you. It's not just about the quantity of the fodder. The quality plays a major role too.
Oh, right. Like, you could have tons of fodder, but if it's not very nutritious, it's not going to do much good.
Exactly. And that ties directly into this concept of livestock productivity. Because while India has this enormous livestock population, when you look at how productive those animals actually are, things like milk yields, meat production, they're actually lower than global averages.
Interesting. So even though they have a lot of animals, those animals might not be producing as much as they could be.
You got it. And those fodder deficits we've been talking about, they play a big role in that because if the animals aren't getting the nutrition they need, well, they're not going to be as productive.
It's like this chain reaction, right? One imbalance can have these ripple effects throughout the entire system.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the challenges: limited land, intense grazing, these regional fodder deficits. It's a lot to process. Is there any light at the end of this tunnel? Like, are there solutions being explored to address these challenges?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I find so inspiring about all of this. Because despite these really complex challenges, there's this incredible amount of innovation and problem solving happening in India. People are tackling these issues head on, and there are some really promising solutions being explored.
So tell me more about these solutions. What's being done to make things better? What are people doing that's working?
Well, one area that I find particularly fascinating is this idea of developing super fodder. Basically, it's all about these new varieties of fodder crops that are being developed to be way more productive.
Super fodder. I
Right.
love it. So it's like taking those high-yield crop varieties we see in other parts of agriculture and applying that same thinking to animal feed.
Exactly. Researchers are laser focused on things like nutritional content. They're developing fodder crops that pack a bigger nutritional punch. They're also looking at drought resistance, really important in a place like India. And of course, they're trying to develop varieties that are specifically adapted to thrive in different regions, different climates, soil types, that sort of thing.
It's like they're giving farmers a customized toolkit to address their specific local challenges, right?
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is that you can potentially boost fodder production without needing more land. So it's great for sustainability.
That's awesome. Okay, so that's super fodder. What about the land use issue? We talked about all that pressure from grazing and competition for space. Are there solutions being explored to address that side of the equation too?
There are, and this is where things get really cool. Imagine instead of just seeing a field of grass for grazing, you see cows happily munching away among rows of fruit trees, or maybe even timber trees. That's the basic concept behind silvopasture. It's all about integrating trees and grazing livestock on the same land.
Okay, that's super clever. You're getting multiple benefits from the same piece of land. You've got your fodder, you've got your fruit or timber. Talk about multitasking.
Right. And the beauty of these integrated systems is that they go way beyond just productivity. They can have amazing benefits for the environment too. Things like reducing soil erosion, improving soil health. Silvopasture can even help sequester carbon from the atmosphere. It's like a win-win-win situation.
I love it. So it's not just about producing more. It's about producing it in a way that's better for the environment and more sustainable over the long term. Are there other examples of these kinds of win-win solutions?
Absolutely. Another really interesting approach is horticulture. Instead of trees, this one focuses on integrating shrubs into grazing lands. And this can be particularly useful in areas where the land has been degraded, overgrazed or eroded.
Okay, so with horticulture, you're not just producing fodder, you're actually helping to rehabilitate the land at the same time.
Precisely. And the shrubs can provide additional income for the farmers too, things like fruits, nuts, even medicinal plants. So again, you have these multiple layers of benefit.
What's really encouraging is that these solutions, they're not just pie-in-the-sky ideas. I mean, the research actually shows that things like horticulture, they're catching on. Farmers are embracing these new approaches.
That's what I love about it. There's this real sense of ingenuity and resilience out there. And it's not just these big picture solutions either. There's also tons of research being done on things like improving how we process and store fodder, reducing waste. People are getting really creative.
That's awesome to hear. This
Right.
whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener for me. I had no idea just how deep this connection between agriculture and animal husbandry runs in India, or just how complex the challenges and the solutions really are.
Right. It's a really nuanced issue. I mean, we've just barely scratched the surface here, but it's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how interconnected everything is, right? How something that happens on a farm in India can have ripple effects that are felt all over the world.
That's what's so important about understanding these systems. Because if we're going to find solutions that work, solutions that can feed a growing planet sustainably, we need to look at the whole picture.
Exactly. It's all connected. Well, on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Anytime.